Well, hello everyone. I make it 11:02, so I think we will get started. I'm sure those who are still joining will be able to catch up on where we are. Welcome. My name is Jack Butterworth. I am the head of the Grants and Funding Office at the National Archives in Kew. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you here to this webinar, which is launching our new Risk and Resilience Fund, our two new grant schemes for dealing with risk and organisational resilience in the archive sector. I'm joined by my colleagues James Hodgson and Philip Gale, who are going to present. But before we get going on some of the detail of the grant scheme itself, I just wanted to offer a little general introduction to who I am and who my team is, and some of the strategic initiatives that are ongoing at TNA at the moment. So with apologies to anyone who heard this introduction at the Cataloguing Grants webinar a couple of weeks ago, I'm just going to spend 5 minutes telling you about the new directions we're set up for grants and funding at the National Archives. In November of last year, National Archives constituted a new department as part of its own internal structure called the Grants and Funding Office, which it's been my huge privilege to lead. And that's part of a wider determination from our institution to kind of get into the funding space in a more determined, in a more strategic and a more coherent way. As some of you will know, we have run grant schemes for the archive sector for a long period of time. I think it's for over 10 years now. And in the last 5 years alone, we've distributed something like £3 million in grants to archives across the UK. But that's never really been collected together in a really coherent strategy. We've never really sorted out exactly what our positioning is and who we want to be as the grant funder. And so myself and my team have been tasked with bringing that together for the first time. And to help inform that strategy, I know that a lot of you will have contributed to our consultation, which took place over summer and autumn of this year. We had 125 responses to a survey about funding of archives, which was really fantastic and has provided us with an amazing data set. We've run a number of key stakeholder interviews. We've looked at our previous grants. We run a section at the ARA conference, and we've spent 3 months, generally listening to what we think, you need, what you told us that you need in terms of grant funding, both in the what we should actually fund, but also in the how we should do it, what, our position as a sector development body for England should be, and how we should ultimately seek to pursue the common goal of attracting more funding and better funding towards archives. And very much in response to that consultation process, you'll see these new Archives Resilience and Records at Risk grants that we're launching today. It's not a totally new idea, of course. The Records at Risk scheme ran very successfully last year, and I think Philip will have some examples to share of the impactful work that has been done with that funding. And before that, of course, there was the COVID-19 fund, which was a bit of a one-off event, but which in 2021 made some really substantial support available. But we want to continue this on an ongoing basis, on a stable basis, to something that happens every year. We are all very, very alert to the fact that the resilience challenges, financial challenges, cost of living and so on and so forth are not going away. We are clear that the organisational health of archives is a continual struggle and should be something that is among our priorities, and among our priorities funding. And indeed, we are talking to many other organisations. I can think of, the lottery for one example, but there are plenty of others who are moving into this resilience space and are becoming more and more interested in the organisational health of organisations across the cultural heritage sector. And we want to play our part in that for archives, which is why we have set up this fund. We wish it were a little bit bigger, of course, but we have an ambition to grow it, and we have an ambition to keep this stream of funding now as a stable part of our portfolio for the coming years. And that portfolio is going to change a little bit. So beyond just this programme, involving our cataloguing grants, involving our research grants and many other things, we are working across the board on how we deliver money. And our ambition is to launch that to you all at some point in the early next year. And what we hope to get to is when we get to our next financial year, starting on the 1st of April 2023, you should be able to see a really coherent single program of all of our grant funding that National Archives offers, that we hope will be able to provide funding, provide grants as accessibly as possible to all of you, but also that we'll be able to attract other funders. We hope to get other government institutions, charity sector, and so on and so forth, more interested in archives to advocate for all of you and to advocate for the huge impact that we know funding the archive sector can have. And so please do keep your eyes peeled in the new year as we start to launch that vision. And I'm really, really excited to see the directions we are going to take our funding strategy in 2023 and beyond. That is enough general waffle for me. So let's get down to the business at hand. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, James Hodgson, our head of archive sector funding, who's going to present a little bit more of the details of the Risk and Resilience Fund for you all. Finally, just one housekeeping note that I should have said at the beginning but forgot. This webinar is going to be recorded, but we're only going to record the presentation portions of this. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Please do put any Q&A in the chat as you wish while the presentations are ongoing. And as soon as James and Philip's presentations are finished, we will turn the recording off and we can then have our Q&A session. And I will see you for that. Over to James.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really appreciated, and I'm really pleased to see so many of you in the virtual room. So to start with, to speak about the two grants, as Jack mentioned, over the summer, we consulted with the sector, and as a result of that consultation, we'll be launching these two new grant programs, one designed to build archives resilience and the other for records that are at risk. This funding is provided in association with the British Record Association, the Business Archives Council, and the Archives and Records Association. We've designed these programs to address short and medium-term structural and financial challenges in the archive sector. The Archives Resilience Grant Programme will be for resilience building projects of up to £15,000, and I will speak about those grants first. I will then pass over to my colleague Philip to discuss the Records at Risk grant programme, which will be a rolling fund designed to save historic records in immediate peril, providing funds of up to £5,000. Both of these grants build on the successes of our COVID-19 and Records at Risk funds, and there are further details of what we funded and the sorts of programs we funded for those previous rounds available on our website. So to start with, and to speak a little bit about the Archives Resilience grants, as mentioned, they are a grant program in which we're inviting archives to apply for resilience building projects of up to £15,000. There is no minimum level of funding to apply for, and we've seen some impactful projects for certainly lower than £15,000 in the past. The grant is designed to create sustainable solutions which will allow organisations to respond to and to manage change. Some examples of ideas that might build resilience or might be appropriate for you would be programs or proposals that would lead to increased organisational stability, increasing staff capacity and enhancing staff skill sets, proposals to reduce operating costs or to increase income generation activities, proposals that would allow you to develop increasingly care for and to enrich your collections. Proposals that empower your reach into communities and the ability to grow your audiences. Other proposal topics could be ensuring your collections are safely preserved. As with most of our funding, this would include digital preservation. Proposals that consider diversity, equality, and inclusion, and proposals that are designed to respond to the impacts of climate change, such as developing energy efficiency within archive services. If you would like to apply, you would need to be eligible to apply. So to speak a little bit about the eligibility requirements, this funding is open to all organisations based within the United Kingdom, including not-for-profit, public sector and for-profit organisations. To be eligible to apply, you must have an archive collection, which is the subject of the application, and this needs to be located in the United Kingdom. If the archive is not currently accessible for public use, you must have the intention and plans to make the collection freely accessible. You must employ or have access to professional support from an archivist or a similarly qualified person. The awards cannot fund overheads, full cost recovery, or management fees. They're not appropriate for collections acquisition, and we also won't be able to fund the costs incurred prior to the date of any award offered from us. Most other cost categories will be eligible for funding. If you do have any doubts or questions about your proposal, please do feel free to get in contact with us and we should be able to clarify. As with most of our grants, again, we are very open and would encourage partnership projects and consortium applications as appropriate when applying for the funding. In order to assess your applications or applications in general, we have 4 equally weighted criteria, and we will explore these criteria through our questions, which I will come on to in a minute. The 4 criteria we'll be looking at when we're assessing the applications are need, impact, sustainability and legacy, and deliverability. We are looking at need, and which is why and how the funded activity will build resilience and why this resilience activity is needed. What challenges or opportunities the funded intervention would be seeking to address. We would also be looking at impact. We would want to see projects with a real demonstrable effect on archives that would ensure that collections continue to be cared for and accessible. We would also like to understand the impact of the project on the organisation and its users, with consideration of diversity and inclusion within your answer. The third assessment criteria is sustainability and legacy, and we would like to understand how the intervention would have impacts and last beyond our funding, because we would be looking at projects building resilience and therefore creating a legacy of change. We would want to understand how the project will contribute to continued sustainability, and where appropriate, the environmental impact and costs of delivering the solution. Finally, we look for projects that are achievable, projects that are deliverable, and to understand this, we ask for clear costings and project plans. Your budget will be assessed by the panel for reasonableness of costings and proportionality, and you may receive feedback on your costings as proposed. So to move on to the actual application form itself, this first page I'm not going to spend very much time on because it's all very simple questions. We're asking for the name of your organization, the name and the position of the lead contact. In particular, this is important for network partnerships or consortia applications, simply so we know who to get in contact with. The telephone number and email address, again, so we can get in contact with you, postal address, a proposed project start date and a proposed project end date. These are what you would like and what you would aspire to. They are not 100% set in stone, and on award of the contract, we will confirm the start date and end date with you. We would also like to understand the status of the collection that you are applying for, whether or not you're a custodian of the collection or a collecting institute. And if you're a collecting institute, whether or not that collection is owned by you or deposited with you. This relates very strongly to the need to or the aspiration to provide public access to collections, and gives us some level of reassurance that the collection will be available for public use for the duration and beyond of the grant. The more substantive questions are very directly linked to the assessment criteria I just spoke about. And to start with, we have a general question which is not assessed, well, not directly assessed or scored, in which we ask to understand a little bit more about your organization and archive collection, including a little about how your archive is managed. Through this, we would like to understand your access to professional archive expertise and how you plan to continue this through the grant, how you currently or plan to make the archive accessible to people outside of your organization, and the nature and significance of the collection, including its level of usage. And that level of usage can be current, but it can also be indicative. If you are getting lots of inquiries from researchers or other interesting groups that you're unable to provide at the moment, but through this grant, you'll be able to increase access to your collections, please do speak about that. We then go on to look at the 4 assessment criteria. So we start very directly with need. In this, we ask you to describe the need for the grant, why you are doing the grant. To do this, and I will come on to discussing a little bit more and showing you, we have asked that you use the Archives and Records Association's Archive Service Resilience Indicator tool. This is an Excel spreadsheet, which again, I will show you in a minute, which can be a really useful prompt for thought and consideration of areas of strength and possible areas of development for your organization. And we found it a very practical tool for guiding thought. We will then ask about impact and the impact of your project, particularly linked to the previous question, how the project will impactfully address the needs identified in question 9. The last 2 questions we ask are about sustainability and legacy, how your project will create a legacy of change for your organization, how it contributes to sustainable risk management, the future public access of your project, and if appropriate, the environmental sustainability impacts of delivering and the ongoing delivery of your resilience project program. Finally, we asked the questions about deliverability. In this, we would ask for a short summary of the project plan with any key identifiable milestones, so key points in delivery of your project. Your total funding request in British pounds, with a breakdown of your budget. This breakdown can be very top level at this stage. We don't want a fully itemized list of your budget, so down to very minor expenses, like we want to buy 50 pens, they'll cost us £5. We would much prefer to see the headlines of your budget, so staffing, travel costs, incidental costs, stationery would come under kind of project resource costs here. The maximum funding amount, as I've mentioned previously, will be £15,000. We are very welcoming of proposals under £15,000. The more projects we can fund, the more impactful projects we can fund, the better really for us and for everyone concerned. So please do feel free to vary your budget. You don't need to go up to £15,000, but if you do, and it's a strong project, that's also a good number to come up with. Finally, in applying, you're welcome to include some supporting documentation. You can include letters of support, so these can be institutional, that the organization you work with supports the delivery of your project. It can also be letters of support from interested stakeholders, so they might be research colleagues, they might be community groups, really anyone who is supportive of your work and the project that you do. It might also include project plans, it can include images, and we would ask that it includes a copy of the resilience tool, which I am about to speak about. So, what is the Archives and Records Association's Archive Service Resilience Indicator tool? As mentioned, this is a useful tool for guiding your thoughts, for giving you the opportunity to think about where your organization currently is, where potential gaps or areas that you might want to develop are, and almost give you a sense, a very visual sense of where you can develop, what quick wins there might be, what longer term work you might need to invest in, and ideas and inspiration for building the resilience of your organization. We absolutely understand that every applicant is likely to have different needs and different approaches to building organizational resilience, and that every organization will be at a different stage of resilience when they come to review this tool. The tool itself was developed by the Archives and Records Association, Archives and Records Council of Wales, the National Records of Scotland, the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, the Scottish Council on Archives, the National Archives, and the Welsh Government through its Museum and Archives and Libraries Division, all of which are partners for the UK Service Accreditation Standards, and further guidance notes on using the document are available from the Archives and Records Association by following the link there. We will put these presentations online, And our guidance notes on our website do have all these links indicated on them. So you don't need to write these down at the moment. They are all available on our website or through this presentation, which will be uploaded later. I'd now like to stop sharing the presentation and show you a little example of what the resilience tool is, how to complete it, and what sort of information you would get at the end of it. So forgive me a moment while I make use of my technical skills to swap screens. So I think hopefully you should now be seeing the resilience tool itself. I don't suppose one of my colleagues would just be able to confirm that you can see the.
We can see that. Thank you.
Perfect. So this is the resilience tool developed, as I say, by the Archives and Records Association in collaboration with the numerous other organizations I mentioned previously. It looks big, it looks long, and I think the first thing really to say about it is that it should be a quick exercise. We are not looking for you to spend a really long time or to explore or examine each of the different criteria in it. It should take approximately 5 to 10 minutes to complete. The document itself has 5 different tabs across the bottom. The first one looks at your organization itself and areas of resilience for your organization. The second looks at your collections and areas of resilience for building resilience in your collections. And the third looks at your stakeholders and engagement with stakeholders. The final 2 tabs look at summary scoring as well as some visual representations of the scoring. So to show how you actually use it, it's as simple as putting an X in a box. Each of the statements or each of the questions come in the form of a statement. So to start with, the first one is, does your organization have a written mission statement? Maybe it does, in which case you'd put an X in yes. Maybe it doesn't, an X in no. Maybe it's in development, or you have a partial one, or you have an old one that you'd like to update. Put an X in partially. If you don't know, you don't know. That's an entirely fine answer, as is, actually, we don't believe that a written mission statement is necessary for us, so it's a not relevant. Here we will say, yes, we do have a written mission statement. To the right of the screen, you have a section called Action. We do not expect you to complete this section when you submit your tool or your completed tool to us. This is really for your own notes or for you to record any actions that you would like to follow up on. So all we do is we go through this document and we answer as honestly and as informed as we can be, realizing that this is a first draft, if you like, a first attempt at understanding where our organizations are in terms of resilience. So we've said we do have a mission statement. The next question is whether or not the mission statement informs all planning. Here we can say partially. Are all mission or all procedures informed by the mission statement? No, they're not. Is it informed? Is it clearly and regularly communicated to internal stakeholders? Here we'll say yes. And is it clearly and regularly communicated to key external stakeholders? Here we'll say no. As I say, this is really for your own thoughts. It is not, there is no right or wrong answers. It is talking about your own service, where you are, and hopefully giving you some guidance and inspiration for your own resilience projects and resilience proposals. We would go through the whole document. As you can see, I've already filled out some of these sections, and we would put our X's in each of the boxes. Once we've completed the first tab, we move to the second tab, which looks at collections and starts with collection development. Here you'll see it's much the same as the last tab, statement questions in which we answer no, partially, yes, don't know, or not relevant. The first one being, is there a written collecting policy? The next question, has this policy been revised in the last 5 years? So hopefully you're seeing that these questions are quite quick yes, no statements, or yes, no, maybe statements. Third tab is looking at your stakeholders, the people engaged with through your archive. And here we are looking again at yes, no, maybe statements. Does your service have an access and engagement policy? Is access a top priority for the service? Does your governing body support access to the collections, etc., etc.? I'm going to keep repeating it. We absolutely understand each applicant is likely to have different needs and different organizational goals. So there are no right and wrong answers. This is for your information and for your understanding and to help guide your thought processes. Once you've completed those first 3 tabs, you'll be given a summary listing on the 4th tab. In this, it summarizes the different states of your organization. So firstly, we're looking at the operational profile. And here we can scan quickly down and see, of the answers I've given, I have 9 not present or no's, which are coming out as red and therefore potentially more important. We can quickly scan down here and see where are most of my not presents happening. They're happening in my mission statement. So perhaps a mission statement would be something to work on, reducing my reds and moving them into yellow or greens, if that's a priority that I consider a priority. This is a very numeric display of what you've already written. And the final tab is a much more visual representation. Some people like to have the entire form to review. Some people would prefer summaries. Some people prefer the information presented in a visual way like this. Unfortunately, I know it's going to be very small on your screen, so I'm going to try and zoom in just on one section. And hopefully you can see, but this document will be available on our website and you'll be able to have your own go after the webinar. So for our operational status, we're presented with a pie chart in which we can see a lot of green, some yellows, some reds, and some don't know or we don't think it's necessary here. Perhaps we want to consider these reds and these yellows, and we want to know where they stand or where they are currently. And we are given another summary of that in a cumulative bar chart here. Here we can quickly have a look and see, okay, my highest levels are really within the mission statement. My highest levels of actionable things, reds and yellows, are within the mission statement. or the access information, procedures and activities. So I might like to then go back and have a look and say, where are my reds coming out here? We don't have a mission, or our policies are not informed by a mission statement. Is that something we want to change? Will that help build our organizational resilience? Is this something that we want to apply to the National Archives Fund to do? If yes, perfect, that feeds directly into the application. If it's something that you would prefer to do outside of the application, of course, that's entirely fine and relevant. I'm going to stop talking about the tool itself now and move back to the presentation so we can move into the risk grants. But obviously, if you do have any questions about the tool itself or anything else on the resilience grant, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and myself and colleagues will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Hi, Philip.
Hi. Well, I'm Philip Gale, head of the Standards and Improvement team, and I've been leading on records at risk for a few years now at the National Archives. It's fair to say that archives have always faced risks, and those of you with an eagle eye will notice that we have two tally sticks there, and a famous incident of archival risk is overzealous records management in 1834 that led to the loss of a substantial part of the parliamentary archives. Other risks can be less dramatic, and these include businesses going into liquidation, obsolete software that renders data inaccessible, or mold damage to documents. The loss of any archive is a diminution of our heritage and reduces the diversity of sources available for future generations. And that is essentially our motivation, which is that we want to protect the archival heritage of the nation by ensuring that as many identities and communities of contemporary Britain have a chance for their archives to survive, particularly some of those more vulnerable voices that perhaps are historically being overlooked. So this fund is a rescue fund, but it's also, in a strange, obliquely way, a diversity fund. And we're also building on our past work on this area of, and particularly the work of the COVID fund and the Records at Risk fund. The COVID fund was a substantial sum of £500,000 given to us by the Treasury in 2020, which we distributed in 2021. And the Records at Risk fund, on which this fund is very much closely based, was earlier this year when we distributed £31,000 for the rescue of certain vulnerable collections. And to give you some flavour of some of the collections that we have actually managed to secure with that intervention, a very nice example is supporting MACE, the Film Regional Archives, film and photographs of the Lincoln engineering firm Rustons. We also have been supporting the Museum of Youth Culture to preserve a photographic collection that documents the styles and social movements formed by the youth culture from the mods and rockers in the 1950s and 60s to acid rave house ravers of the 1980s in Northern England. We've also have assisted the Centre of Policy on Ageing in securing the transfer to a permanent home of their research archive concerning the study of people and old age, a subject that is increasingly relevant for those of us heading towards retirement. And we also gave a grant to the Garden Museum to finance a survey of the records of R. Halliday & Co. Limited, who were foremost horticultural engineers in the late 19th century and had many prestigious projects in the earlier part of the 20th century. So this fund is very much designed on building on that record. The Records at Risk programme is a rolling programme. We intend this to be a permanent part of our armoury of protection for vulnerable collections. It's designed for urgent, short notice interventions to save historic records, whether they're in physical or digital formats that face immediate peril. The focus will be on records and services that are unprotected by legislation, such as the archives of businesses, charities, and private individuals, and not on public records, which do enjoy a degree of legal protection under the Public Records Act. It's a flexible grants programme, open to applications, as I say, on a rolling basis, and it's available for rapid distribution. And when I come to the end of this presentation, I'll say a bit more on that. You will be able to apply for interventions up to £5,000, and you will be able to receive a response within, we hope, Christmas accepted, within 1 working week of the application of being received. We'll talk a bit about the eligibility. Applicants must be a recognised archival custodian. It does not need to be an accredited archive. So if you haven't got archive service accreditation, you're still welcome to apply. The records at risk must pass the following broad eligibility tests. They must be facing a substantial risk, and this could be abandonment in a warehouse that's facing redevelopment, or it could be they are in a location where their physical survival is at peril, or there is insufficient funding for a service to acquire collection, for example, a temporary storage or transport costs. And the fund is not, I should stress, a purchase fund. It is to assist the acquisition of records through the logistical side and the storage side, but it's not there for purchase funding. There may be other sources of funding for that, which we may be able to point you in direction of, such as the Friends of the National Libraries. The records must have sufficient historical and research significance, and their loss must have an impact on the historic record of a locality, of a region, or a business or organisation. The records must also be currently held within the United Kingdom, which implies that this fund is open to colleagues and services in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And the records can be in analogue or digital formats, and can be inside or outside of the custody of the records creator or a recognised collecting archive institution. So if there is a business that is facing liquidation and the records are still in the custody of that business or the liquidators, that will be eligible for assistance under this fund, as long as there is an archive service that is intending to acquire them, or a suitable collecting institution. Moving on to the assessment criteria, this is frankly unsophisticated, but that is because we aim to do a very rapid decision-making process around these applications. Basically, each application will be scored to a maximum score of 100. And you will see the breakdown. Essentially, we will score up to 10 points for the physical or digital collection, the physical condition or digital condition of the collection that's at risk. That is to take account of just how much resource might be required to make the collection fit for future access. We will also score up to 20 points for the cultural significance and potential research value of the collection. This can be highly subjective, and we hope that the panel's varying perspectives will help to provide an even score there. And then possibly the other very important element in determining a response is, we're still on the scoring points. So if we can go back a slide, please, is the level of threat or vulnerability or barriers to access faced by the collection and the current status of the collection. An example here is where we know that a collection has to be removed from its existing situation at very short notice. That would score very highly. A collection that's perhaps already been acquired and does not face such an immediate level of risk, but still faces issues such as contamination, might not score quite so highly. There will be a spectrum of score there. The other thing we will be scoring on is on the proposal intervention and the technical effectiveness of the proposed course of action, whether the proposed course of action, which might be bringing in a collection into temporary storage pending its appraisal for permanent acquisition by a collecting institution, we will look at that and take a view as to how practical that is. Unlike the Resilience Fund, obviously, we are not going to be focusing on the legacy of the collection longer term, but just what has to be done immediately to secure the collection, to buy time for that collection to be properly acquired and maybe properly appraised. The other other areas where we would score is also the inability of the applicant or the record creator, parent organisation, to fund the proposed intervention, and whether there are any other alternative sources of funding. And essentially, this fund is a last resort fund. It's designed to secure collections where literally, if there is no funding, the collection is in peril. That is to allow us to triage our limited resources around this fund to make sure it goes to the collections in most need in terms of financial support. The other area is we will score is the strength of the proposed public access arrangements, what is intended to be done in the future to ensure that this collection is going to be available to the public and for the research community in the longer term. That does not mean that you need to have elaborate plans about how you're going to deliver that, but a strong approach as to how over time that may be achieved. And then the finally, two foot areas are the impact of the proposed course of action on the records and the applicant's organisation. In other words, will this collection have a positive impact for the new custodian and indeed possibly also for the former custodian as well? And for example, that might be a charity which has a very honourable record of helping its beneficiaries, and there's a risk of that record being lost in the long term if the records are lost. And then finally, this can be an issue. We may score on any ownership issues. Sometimes the ownership, particularly collections that have been abandoned, is not always totally clear, and there may be a degree of opaqueness. That can be a factor that might weigh in certain circumstances. So turning to the application form, the first part of the form is in fact fairly straightforward. Name of the applicant, name and position of the lead contact, telephone number, email address, other contact details. The first significant question is the current location of where the collection or the data is, and whether it's in the direct custody of the applicant or not. And also we would like to know the date range of the material if known. Particularly that can be a challenge if you have got a digital collection sometimes. And then moving on to the questions, we would like to have the applicant's organizational status, whether it's a custodian, a collecting institute, whether the collection is deposited or intended to be deposited, or whether it is actually directly owned by the applicant or is intended to be donated to a collecting institution. And finally, we move on to the next few questions. We would like you to have a short statement. We do not expect a major essay on why you think the collection is significant, known details of its existing and potential levels of use, the current degree of access, and any existing metadata documentation, whether there is in fact, for example, a box list available as a traditional collection. If it's a digital collection, what sort of software platform it might be, what sort of software it's using, what sort of platform it might be on, etc. And then we would like you then, in question 8, and this is particularly important, describe the nature of the risk and the vulnerability of the collection, and to the extent of its formats, and how this will impact on the future impact of access to the collection. We may have a situation where a collection has a very real risk of having to be removed at very short notice because it's going to be orphaned in its current accommodation. An example of that might be a charity downsizing its national headquarters and no longer having the storage areas to store its historic archives on site. Or it might be a subtle risk, such as contamination over time, degrading the collection, such as a major contamination, such as mold, which prevents safe handling of the records and ultimately access. And then finally, we would ask you to describe succinctly your course of action, and if your application was successful, what impact would the records be having on your organization? There are sort of final few questions, which is you will need to explain on the financial side now why you cannot fund, question 10, the collection internally, and nor why the parent organisation or record creators organisation cannot fund this particular intervention, and whether you are applying to other funders for this particular project, and if so, when you might hear back from them. And also an explanation of your thoughts about how to plan future public access to the collection. And we don't expect enormous detail, but we do expect a strong expression of intention about how it's intended that public access might be delivered in the future. Then when we come to the actual budget, there is a recognition in these circumstances that funding costs can be unpredictable, particularly at a time when transport costs, storage costs are rising quite sharply, and so are costs of conservation materials. So we would request a broad breakdown of your anticipated costs with, I should say, bearing in mind the maximum grant for this fund is £5,000. And it might be in the current climate to include a degree of contingency in those costs, with inflation being where it is at present. So that is a broad breakdown of costs. If we've got any queries about that, we can come back to you. We're not expecting a beautifully prepared budget. In these circumstances, that is probably an unreasonable expectation on our part. And then a little bit about the way we hope to assess this fund. The application form, it will be downloadable as a Word document, and it will be available for you to fill in. The application will be emailed to the Archives Grants Funding Office's inbox. There it will be circulated to a remote panel of assessors who will be asked to score the application within 1 working week, Christmas accepted. I'm afraid none of us will be doing it on Boxing Day. But in normal times, we expect to get back to you within 1 week of receipt of application with a rapid response. This is designed to literally to be the rescue collection, the lifeboat collection fund, if you like, for vulnerable collections. And I would finally say a quick word about our partners, the British Records Association and the Business Archives Council and the Archives and Records Association are all associated with this fund and will be assisting in the assessment of the applications. I hope that gives you a reasonable summary of the Records at Risk Fund